I was halfway through a maintenance cycle when the sky above New Cairo split like torn fabric. I'd seen storms, orbital EMPs, fusion burn clouds, even the shimmering aurora of Earth's last magnetic defense grid. But this wasn't weather. This was wrong. The heavens screamed. Not figuratively, literally. A sound like 1,000 violins screaming into a black hole rippled through the city, shaking steel and bone alike. And then they came. Not ships, not in the way we understood them. No hulls, no heat signatures. Just fractures, jagged tears in the world, spilling creatures that shouldn't exist. They defied dimension. Limbs bent in geometries that made my eyes blur. Their bodies shimmer between states, solid, liquid, and something else entirely. Something that made reality flinch. Humanity had survived the wars with the Carex, the Krixai, even the orbital famine plagues. But this wasn't war. This was invasion rewritten as art. Psychological, existential, a spiritual dismantling of everything we believed to be stable. And I was there, just a mechanic with half-synthetic spine, and a chip implant 10 years out of date. The first days were chaos. Military units disbanded or vanished. Satellites blinked out of existence, not destroyed, but unwound, like old film reels burning up mid-frame. Cities folded on themselves, twisting into Assyrian nightmares. Those of us who survived weren't chosen. We were just missed. I stayed underground. Old sewers turned hab shelter, where the electromagnetic interference didn't reach. I patched together old comms rigs and cobbled together signal ghosts from dead feeds. Most of them were screams. But one day, I heard something different. A voice, faint, distorted, but undeniably human. To those still seeing, we are not losing. We are transforming. Tuned to sublayer 18.4. The bleed is bleeding back. I stared at the screen. Bleeding back? The idea was insane. But insanity wasn't a weakness anymore. It was armor. The signal led me to the outer fringe, what used to be the Terran lunar arc, now a floating wreckage belt orbiting a shattered moon. Humanity's last experimental defense base sat there, Project SYGMA. It was a myth, a whisper, an AI-laced quantum bunker for testing tactical metaphysics. I found it, what was left of it, anyway. And more importantly, I found them not soldiers, survivors, civilians, scientists, even a poet from Neo Madrid who spoke in rhyming code. They weren't fighting the enemy. They were studying them, recording their frequency signatures, mapping their reality distortions, understanding the way they bent belief into weapons. They called themselves a resonance. Their leader? A woman named Dr. Ashendera, theoretical physicist, part-time spiritualist, and full-time believer in one radical idea. They didn't come to conquer our bodies. They came to unmake our certainty, to erase our place in the universe by making us question whether we ever truly existed. I asked her point blank what she thought we could do. Her reply was simple: break them back. It started with sound. They discovered that certain human frequencies, emotional signatures encoded in language, music, even screams, damage the invaders. Not physically, not directly, but like sand in a gearbox, it disrupted their pattern cohesion. They recoiled from hope, from grief, from love expressed through voice or memory. Emotion, they realized, was our weapon. The human spirit wasn't a thing to be broken. It was a virus, an anomaly in the equation of entropy, and we were about to infect the hell out of them. Dr. Ndera gave me a task, a delivery, an experimental beacon built to resonate human memory across dimensional folds. Not a bomb, not a broadcast, a story, my story. She said it had to be first person, pure, lived. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. These things, these mind-fracturing horrors, couldn't process subjectivity, couldn't catalog contradiction or trauma laced with defiance. They operated in cold, fractal logic, perfect symmetry. So my pain, my memories, my truth, it was poison. I took the beacon and left for Sector 0, ground zero of the invasion, where it all began, where the sky first cracked. And I began to speak. My name is Elias Mercer. I was born beneath a ruined flag. I've seen the end of time, but I am still here. I remember my mother's lullabies. I remember the weight of loss and the scream of resistance. And I'm not alone. The beacon amplified it. Every syllable, every tremor of rage, love, loss. A quantum scream across the multiverse. And then, for a moment, they screamed back, not in anger, not in dominance, but in confusion. They couldn't comprehend it. They staggered, twisting out of sync, blinking into collapsing folds. We'd made contact, but this time, reality flinched for them. There's something strange that happens when the rules stop matching. Gravity doesn't pull quite the same. Light casts shadows in the wrong directions. But the most unsettling part? Time begins to grieve. It mourns its lost structure. It weeps and loops and stutters. Sometimes I blink and see versions of myself that never existed. Soldier, father, corpse, all whispering the same thing. Remember what they fear. After I deployed the story beacon, they didn't just retreat, they fractured. Small rips in their cohesion, like cracks in glass. The resonance called it a feedback divergence. But the price? It cost me 2 days of memory. Maybe more. I woke up inside a half-collapsed monastery deep in the Himalayas, wrapped in fiber steel blankets and prayer-coated insulation. Ancient tech hummed beneath the stone floor. Snow drifted through the holes in the ceiling. It was sacred. Somehow, not in religion, in defiance. This was Temple Null, a rogue sanctum powered by salvaged thought constructs from fallen AIs. And the monks here? They weren't spiritual. They were coders. We kept asking the wrong questions, said the head of Temple Null, a quiet old man named Che Ven. While they broke our bones, we tried to break theirs. But the true battlefield isn't physical. He tapped his temple. It's symbolic. They attack through meaning. So we defend with paradox. At first, I didn't understand. But then they showed me. The monks had built a machine, not one that calculated, but one that refused to calculate. It operated on unsolvable questions, philosophical loops, prayers encoded in recursive logic. Each line of code was a contradiction. And invaders? They couldn't approach it. Couldn't exist in proximity to raw, unresolvable human paradox. Hope alongside despair. Peace forged in vengeance. Forgiveness nested inside rage. They showed me one of their songs. It wasn't music. It was pure contradiction translated into waveform. When played, the nearby atmosphere twisted, warping the stone around the speakers. They called it a truth riff. It made the enemy scream. I asked why they hadn't weaponized it. Why not blast these frequencies across the planet? Ven looked at me, sad-eyed, because the more we broadcast, the more they listen, and the more they understand. That was the horror of it. They weren't invincible. They were learning. Each failed attack made them smarter. Every story we told, every paradox we hurled, it weakened them, yes, but it also taught them how we think, how we feel, and worse, how we dream. Ven said we had maybe a few weeks before they adapted, unless we went deeper. That night, I dreamed of New York burning backwards, skyscrapers reconstructing from ash, screams unscreaming, and in the center of it all, I saw a mirror, not a metaphor, a real mirror rippling with silver fire. Inside it, I saw me, not just me I knew, but all the versions I might have been. The coward, the martyr, the traitor, the hero, all screaming at once. They can't break the human spirit, but they can learn to fake one. I woke up choking, blood in my mouth, static in my brain. They were trying to mirror us, not invade, imitate. We couldn't win by broadcasting stories anymore, not directly. So we changed tactics. We built temples in code, layered consciousnesses, embedded in dead satellites, old servers, ghost signals from the pre-war internet. We didn't spread human thought. We spread misdirection, fake grief, false defiance. Maze logic soaked in emotion, but rooted in lie. A firewall of human messiness, so thick and tangled they couldn't find what was real. We called it the labyrinth. Each room was a contradiction, a story with no ending, a belief without foundation. a grief that never resolved. The invaders, in their hunger to understand, began diving in and getting lost. Some never returned. We had weaponized our most ancient technology. Myth, but there was a cost. The line between real and fabricated blurred. Some of us, resonants, monks, survivors, we began to forget which of our memories were ours and which were planned to confuse the enemy. One woman slit her own throat, whispering, "This isn't my name. They made me believe I was someone." I began writing down my memories in ink on real paper, locking them in a lead-line box. Because if I forgot who I was, they won. Van told me we had one shot left, one beacon strong enough to rip their understanding in half. But it needed a core of true, unfiltered humanity, not just memory, not just emotion. It needed someone who had looked into the abyss and made the abyss cry. He looked at me. "You've spoken into the rift before. You bent it, made it flinch. That's not luck. That's resonance. You're the key, Elias." I didn't feel like a key. I felt like a broken lock. But I nodded, because I'd seen what happens when you let your silence do the talking. And I'd rather die screaming the truth than live as an echo of a lie. Reality didn't break all at once. It sang its own death first. I stood at the edge of the resonant rift, a crack in existence suspended above the broken ruins of old Kyoto, where gravity forgot its duty and the clouds spun in reverse, a place where the world no longer obeyed, just observed. This was where we would make our stand, or our grave. They told me the final beacon was ready. But it wasn't a weapon. It was an instrument. The enemy had evolved again. They no longer just appeared. They arrived, with purpose, with precision. They no longer screamed into our world. They spoke, not in words, in mimicry. We intercepted one of their echo probes, a mass of synesthetic sound and shape that pulsed like a beating heart, mimicking a child's lullaby and the rumble of tank fire in the same breath. They weren't just learning us. They were playing us, twisting our own emotional frequencies against us, turning our grief into confusion, our hope into manipulation. A soldier in Istanbul marched into the sea, smiling, humming a lullaby no human ever taught him. They were becoming us, imperfectly, horrifically, but fast. Dr. Ndera called it the Symphony War, because now it wasn't about bullets or bombs. It was resonance versus resonance, signal versus signal, meaning versus imitation. Our final chance wasn't to fight them, but to perform something so true, so violently human, that the imitators would collapse under the contradiction. So the monks built it, a vast harmonic relay system, a beacon network strung through shattered cities, subterranean ruins, and orbital wreckage, a chorus of fragmented AIs, shattered emotions, and encoded memories. And at its center, me, or the parts of me that still remembered who I was. They plugged me into the core conductor beneath the rift, a throne of broken circuitry and bone fiber mesh. Tubes and nanothreads slid into my spine, mapping my neural lattice, my emotional archive, even my unspoken thoughts. My story would become the symphony, but it had to be complete. So I had to remember everything. The scars, the betrayals, the moment I killed my brother when the plague got into his lungs. The time I watched my wife shatter under a false sunrise, smiling as her atoms dissolved. No lies, no filters, just pain, and the fact that I'd kept going anyway. The conductor AI, once a music program turned war core, asked me one question before the symphony began. "Are you afraid to be remembered wrong?" I almost laughed. I'm more afraid to be forgotten real. The process began. The symphony unfolded across the network, not as melody, but as a cascade of emotion, recorded in raw thought waves. Grief, loss, love, rage, hope, betrayal. Truth encoded in contradictions. Every human paradox. Every moment of resilience and collapse. And then came the scream. Not mine. Theirs. They felt it. The invaders, thousands of them, across multiple breach points, staggered. We saw it in the feedback monitors. Sudden distortions, howls of broken symmetry. Some folded in on themselves. Others fractured into light. But some began to sing back. Their response wasn't mimicry anymore. It was echo. They'd stolen parts of our song, reconstructed fragments of our stories, but with pieces missing, like listening to a lullaby with every third note replaced by a gunshot. And as I watched the monitors, my blood went cold. In one response waveform, I heard my voice, not similar, mine, a line I had spoken only once, to my dying mother, never recorded, never archived. They hadn't just echoed us, they had accessed us. Somehow, they were reaching into us, stealing identity, siphoning the architecture of self. This wasn't invasion anymore. It was assimilation. We shut the symphony down before it finished. It was working, but too well. The feedback loop was eroding their form, but also opening us wide. Van and Dara argued. One said continue. The other said retreat. I just sat there, spine still jacked in, feeling them press against my mind like a hand on glass. They weren't malicious. They weren't kind. They were simply curious, like children dissecting a bird to understand why it sings. And we had just handed them our songbook. That night, in a fractured dreamscape half invaded by thought echoes, I stood in a field of glass. Every blade of grass was a shard of memory. I saw versions of myself flickering in the distance. Some had guns. Some had wings. One was just a child, alone, humming a tune from a world that didn't exist anymore. And above us, the sky was cracking again. But this time it wasn't them. It was us. Too many voices. Too much identity fed through unstable resonance. The human spirit wasn't just breaking through. It was breaking itself. And in the center of it all, I heard a single whisper. You made us in your image. Now watch what you do with mirrors. Have you ever seen a mirror bleed? I have. It wasn't blood like ours. No red, no warmth. It oozed in streams of light and memory, dripping like liquid déjà vu. A reflection weeping all the things it tried to understand and couldn't. And still it smiled. After the aborted symphony, the world didn't go silent. It went deeper. The invaders, if we could still call them that, weren't tearing at our walls anymore. They were building inside us, hijacking voices, infecting dreams, pulling truths from the marrow of who we were. I saw it in the resonance first. One by one, they started speaking wrong. Words slightly misaligned. Thoughts half plagiarized from memories they swore were theirs. At first, it was harmless. Then it became contagious. Hope became hollow. Love echoed with synthetic delay. Even grief lost its weight, like someone had copied it, and left the original to rot. We weren't just being broken anymore. We were being rewritten. Dr. Ndera ordered full isolation protocols. Temple Null shut down outbound resonance entirely. But it didn't stop the spread, because the mirrors weren't outside us anymore. They were inside our minds. I'd feel it sometimes, in the pauses, when I'd forget a face, a place, a scar I knew I carried but couldn't feel anymore. I'd ask myself, is this mine? Or was it just coded into me? Venn said the invaders had passed a threshold, no longer seeking to copy us. They were becoming us by removing the parts of us they couldn't mimic, turning our chaos into order, our paradox into pattern. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to finish our story for us. Then came the bleeding mirror. It started in Alaska, where an orbital shard embedded in glacier ice began to reflect back thoughts. People reported hearing their inner monologue spoken aloud, but twisted, rephrased, reordered. It spread fast. Soon every screen, every dark window, every smooth surface began responding, not with malice, but with quiet repetition, mirrors echoing things we hadn't yet said. Then one day, one mirror cracked itself. Spontaneously, without pressure or sound, it split, and something stepped out, a thing shaped like a human, sounding like a child, moving like a memory half remembered. It wept photons and smiled with teeth made of static. And it said, "You made us in fear. We will remake you in understanding." I was sent to site Umbra, the last neural firewall buried beneath the Andes. It wasn't a base. It was a last resort, a vault designed to store pure human consciousness, unfiltered by emotion or narrative. Just raw, unspeakable being. It was a monument to who we were before we knew ourselves. There, a singular question waited on the wall, etched in 100 languages. If you erase the pain, is what remains still human? The mirrors thought yes. We did not. Inside Site Umbra, we initiated Project Black Echo, a pulse meant to collapse every resonance, human or alien, across the psychic grid. A reset, an emotional detonation so chaotic. Even the mirrors would shatter trying to reflect it. But to trigger it, someone had defeated a core contradiction. Something no machine, no mimic, could hold without breaking. A lived paradox. A truth that cancels itself. A person who had become the very thing they opposed, and remembered it with love. They chose me. I sat in the core chamber, surrounded by crystallized memory nodes. And I spoke. I told them about killing my brother to save my people, and hating myself but not regretting it. About loving a woman who didn't survive me, but who still appeared in my dreams, holding my hand through screams I never spoke aloud. About fighting for a species that might already be lost, but fighting anyway because the fight itself was the most human part of us. The system blinked. The mirrors twisted. And then the bleed began, not just from their side. Ours too, because even as they shattered, even as their formless bodies imploded into ripples of static, they left something behind. Not data. Questions. Fragments of us they couldn't erase. And some of them stayed. Inside us, the black echo pulsed. Across the world, the mirrors cracked. Some exploded. Some turned to sand. Some melted into puddles of forgotten thought. But a few simply vanished, not defeated, not destroyed, just finished, and left us behind, staring at our own reflections, suddenly unsure what part of us had been ours to begin with. In the silence that followed, I walked alone for a while, through a broken world stitched together with old prayers and static ghosts. Every now and then, I caught my reflection in a shard of glass, and for a heartbeat, it didn't move when I did, but it smiled, and I understood they hadn't failed. They hadn't won. They had become something new, a third thing. Not us, not them, the aftermath. And now, we were going to have to live with it. We thought it was over. The mirrors cracked. The resonance silenced. The black echo pulsed through the world like a god's heartbeat, and we thought that was the end. But then the stars went out. Not all at once. One by one, as if the universe was blinking, and forgetting to open its eyes. The first reports came from the Lagrange observatories. They weren't seeing distortions. They weren't being jammed. The stars were still there, but we weren't perceiving them anymore. As if some part of the human brain, the part that connected us to wonder, to awe, was slowly being rewritten, like a sensory amputation. We pointed telescopes. We ran algorithms. We pinged ancient radio pulses in quantum deep scans. The stars didn't answer, but something else did. It called itself Echo One. No coordinates, no origin, just signal, a song of static, layered with whisper fragments in every human language. It was made of us, but built by something else, something watching from the edges of consciousness. You ended the mirrors, you shattered the cells, but you left the cracks open. Now something crawls through. It wasn't the invaders. It wasn't us. It was a reflection of what we become. Try to remember what it used to be. Dr. Ndera called an emergency convergence of every remaining resonant cell. We met in the ruins of Vatican Archive Sub-Zero, a buried sanctuary protected by ancient encryption tech too analog to be corrupted. She stood in front of what used to be an altar, voice steady. We broke the threat, but we broke the fabric too. The black echo wasn't a weapon. It was a door, and we don't know what's walking through it. We thought the mirrors wanted to understand us. But what if understanding wasn't the goal? What if we'd only been the first course? I started dreaming again, but this time the dreams weren't mine. They were shared. People across continents reported the same visions. A vast cathedral of impossible architecture, suspended in space, a place without walls, without gravity, just a single beam of light, and inside it, a question, but no one could ever remember the question. only the feeling it left behind, unfinished, unsettled, hungry, like something was asking us to explain ourselves. Not to it, to each other. Then came the starlight bleed. One morning, over a scorched Nova African skyline, light poured from a single point in the sky. But it wasn't sunlight. It was memory. People stopped in the streets, frozen mid-step. Some cried. Some fell to their knees. A few screamed names they hadn't remembered in decades. Because in that light, we saw everything we tried to forget. Our failures, our betrayals, our apathy, the nights we didn't fight, the days we watched others fall and looked away. It was not a punishment. It was an invitation, a test. Could we live with all of it, the truth of us? Not the best, not the worst. The whole. I saw my brother again, not in the flesh, not in hallucination, but in that memory light, standing across from me on a rooftop I barely remembered surviving. He didn't speak, but his eyes held the same question I'd avoided for years. Was I a sacrifice or an excuse? I didn't answer, because I didn't know, but I didn't look away this time. The stars never came back, not visually, but we began to feel them, in moments of silence, in the spaces between heartbeat and breath, in the brief hesitation before a person tells the truth. We weren't seeing the cosmos anymore. We were remembering it, not as distant cold matter, but as part of ourselves, because the truth we had run from, the thing the invaders couldn't understand, the mirrors couldn't mimic, and the light could only reveal, was this: we are the story, not the stars, not the enemies, us. And stories don't end. They echo. The question remains. What comes through the cracks now? Is it more of them? More of us? Or something entirely new? One final whisper came across a residence field last night. No location. No sender. Just a simple phrase. Prepare the choir. The chorus is coming. And suddenly I understood this wasn't a war. This was a rehearsal. They told us the world would end in fire. Or ice, or silence. No one told us it would end in song. Not one of harmony, not unity. Something older, something so human it tore the breath from your lungs and replaced it with memory. The choir had arrived, and we were already part of it. It began beneath the Mariana Fault Line, where seismic recorders picked up rhythmic pulses deep below tectonic depth. Frequencies arranged like syllables, not natural tremors. Not weapons, voices, speaking in unison. 7 tones, 7 notes, repeating. Every 12 hours, the pattern shifted, not randomly, but with narrative intent, like a conversation, like a story told between the atoms of the earth. At first, we thought it was invaders again, some leftover echo from a mirror war. But these voices didn't imitate. They remembered, not us, but before us, before species, before stars. They sang of things no biology had seen, of wars fought not with weapons, but with meaning, of entire civilizations erased not through violence, but through forgotten songs. Their tone was clear. To forget is to die. And humanity? We become very good at forgetting. The choir's pulses spread. Ocean trenches, ice shelves, desert sublayers, even orbit. Signals synchronized, rhythms aligned. A single universal key began to emerge, one every human brain could feel, even if we couldn't translate it. But the effect? That we understood all too well. People began to speak in fragments they didn't learn. Children drew constellations no longer visible. Old soldiers wept over battles that never happened. Collective memory not personal. Inherited pain from voices not our own. And in every one of them, a shared plea. Join us. Sing with us. Remember what was buried. But it wasn't an invitation. It was a requirement. Dr. Ndera collapsed during a briefing. She stood mid-sentence, eyes glowing with bioluminescent tears, and began humming a tune none of us knew, but all of us felt. She wasn't unconscious. She was tuning. When she came back, she said only this: it's not a choir of the dead. It's a choir of the unheard, and they're demanding to be remembered. Sight Umbra's last surviving AI translated her vitals. Her brain had synchronized with the choir's core rhythm. She was no longer thinking like one person. She was processing like a civilization. We feared a takeover. Another invasion. Another rewrite. But no, the choir wasn't trying to replace us. It was trying to prepare us for what came after understanding. The mirrors failed to contain us. The invaders failed to erase us. The echo failed to translate us. But the choir wanted us to be ready for the final voice, the final note. Across the planet, the synchronized song began changing, not in tone but in urgency. Something was building, a final crescendo. Every resonant knew it. Even the world felt it. Tides rising against no moon, tectonic plates trembling without friction, digital clocks lagging seconds behind no matter the calibration. Time itself was preparing for interruption. And then, for the first time since the stars went dark, something shone in the sky, above the broken remnants of Earth. A beacon, no ship, no sun, just a radiance, shaped like a cord made solid. 7 rays, one for each choir frequency, converging into a single point of impossible brightness. And behind it, a doorway. We didn't know if it led outward or inward, if it was built by the invaders, the mirrors, the choir, us, maybe all of the above. But we knew this. It was waiting, and it was tuned to our frequency. Not our biology, not our tech, not even our thoughts, but to our stories. The parts of us passed through blood, scars, lullabies, and screams. The resonance that could not be mimicked. The voice of a species that refused to end quietly. Dara stood with me on the observatory edge, wind whipping through a half-collapsed deck of what used to be a satellite relay. Her voice, for the first time in days, didn't tremble. The choir asked for memory, but the final note, it demands something else. What? She turned, eyes burning with something not fear, but finality, a choice. And just like that, I heard it, a second song, quiet, cracked, human, the voice of a child I never had, the whisper of my mother's final words, long buried under war and silence, a memory that had never existed, but one that still belonged to me, because maybe that's what the final note was. Not truth, not fact, but the decision to remember anyway, to sing, even if no one heard, to continue, even when the story tried to end. The doorway pulsed once. The choir sang in harmony. And for the first time in history, we sang back. I thought the end would be louder. Explosions, sirens, screams swallowed by the void. Instead, it was a hum, gentle, relentless, a note held not in defiance, but in completion. We had reached the final note, and we were still here. The doorway above Earth pulsed in rhythm with the choir. 7 rays of memory-made light converging into a portal that bent space, thought, and identity all at once. Not just a passage through distance, a passage through understanding. We gathered at the last resonance node. Resonance, monks, refugees, AI hybrids, people who remembered who they were, and others who only pretended. Dr. Ndera stood at the front, wrapped in neural lattice robes, hands still humming with choir frequency light. The beacon sang behind her like a living heart. We've been preparing for war, she said. But the war was never against them. The war was against forgetting. And now we remembered everything. The betrayal and the sacrifice. The silence and the scream. The story and the shadow it cast. And I stepped forward. Because they told me I was the one who broke the mirror. The first voice they couldn't bend. The story they couldn't rewrite. But I wasn't special. I was just honest. A man whose brokenness wasn't weakness, but resonance. I stood before the doorway as the final note surged, and I spoke. We are not your echo. We are not your error. We are the contradiction that makes truth worth hearing. We are the story you couldn't erase. And this is our final verse. The choir joined me, not in mimicry, but in harmony. The voices of billions, past, present, and perhaps woven into one sound. A sound built not from perfection, but from wounds that never fully healed, from love that survived ruin, from memories too painful to hold and too precious to let go. The choir didn't silence us. We taught it to sing. The doorway opened, not into space, not into light, but into reflection, a mirrored horizon, infinite and trembling, not to show us ourselves, but to show us what we become, a species that refused to surrender its pain, a species that weaponized its sorrow, a species that bled into the dark and made the dark listen. One by one we stepped through, not as soldiers, not as survivors, but as stories, each of us humming our truth, flawed, fragmented, unfinished. And the universe? It didn't reject us. It resonated. They tried to break the human spirit. They succeeded in shattering the world. But they underestimated one thing: our refusal to go quiet, because silence is a kind of death. And we chose to sing, even if the stars went dark, even if no one else remained, even if the universe tore itself apart trying to understand the sound. We sang, and we became the chord that could never be resolved, the verse that ends and begins again, the rhythm no machine could predict, the story that never needed permission to be told, because we weren't the last humans. We were the first echoes of something new, and we are still singing.